I want to thank the organizers for inviting myself and Professor Robbie. I want to especially thank my friends from Boston who came tonight to hear this talk. And I also want to thank the previous president of Dartmouth, Jim Wright. So I spent a lot of time with Jim, and Jim was an interesting person. He had a huge passion for the wounded warrior. I think at the time he was the only Ivy League president to be a former Marine, and I think there's no such thing as a former Marine. I guess when you're a Marine, you're always a Marine. And I spent many hours in his office discussing what we should do for the wounded warrior. I got involved in the war back in 2003 when I heard a speech about Valley Forge from plastic surgeons down in Baltimore. And there were a number of plastic surgeons, in terms of a very famous one, Joe Murray from Harvard. And Joe may be well known to you, and Joe had done the first kidney transplant 50 years ago. But Joe, as a young surgeon with a bunch of other surgeons at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, formed the largest reconstructive plastic surgery hospital at the time in the world with 1,800 beds. And they all got together and tried to solve those problems generated by World War II. And a lot of those solutions, like in transplantation of skin, ended up with their first kidney transplant about a decade later. So I thought in 2003, shouldn't we look at these wars and reinvent healthcare for the 21st century? So I got myself invited to Walter Reed, where I gave a talk back in 2003. I worked on this with Jim Wright. I came into his office one day and said, I want to run a conference, one of the first conferences on the war, December 2006. And I said to Jim, I'd like to do this. Jim said, how much money do you want? And I had one of those problems of, you want to buy the glasses and the frame and how much you should ask. And I decided I asked for about half as much as I should have, but he just said fine, and he funded this project. And what I find Dartmouth is an amazing institution is to bring people together. So I was able to bring people together from robotics, from the biology fields, from the simulation fields for about a 3-day conference to look at this, and it created a lot of relationships. And those relationships helped me over the years as we looked at different projects in this area. And one of the things that happened through my work is that I got invited to participate in the Defense Science Board to run a panel back in 2007 for several years to look at, are we doing the best we can for the strategic casualty, the soldier like this soldier, James Thayer, who was blown up in the war. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Hurt Locker. So he's one of these guys in Hurt Locker that walked up to a bomb to defuse it and went off. It blew off his hands. It damaged his sciatic nerve in his leg to make it difficult to walk. It blew off his face. It blinded him, took away his hearing, damaged his mouth, and damaged his brain. And what do we plan on doing about this? So I thought that was the challenge in 2003. And I felt that there was an opportunity through the Dartmouth community to make Dartmouth the voice in the wilderness to say, we're going to solve these kind of problems. And because of that work, in fact, 5 years later, President Bush in 2008 made us part of a $100 million program to use regenerative medicine to solve this among robotics programs the Defense Department that I'm involved in and simulation. So a lot of things are occurring. But what's unique about this war is not that they use blast, but what's interesting about these funny curves going up is that we have increasing survival in spite of increasing severity of wounds. So even though the wounds that the weapons are causing, the blast injuries, are more severe than before, people survive. So in past wars, for every 3 wounded in the warfare, 1 died. For the present war, for every 9 wounded, 1 dies. So we're seeing thousands of people severely injured that are accumulating, and how are we going to solve this? And in plastic surgery, there's something called the reconstructive surgical ladder. And in the past, that ladder had direct closure, skin grafts like from World War II, local flaps where we move tissue around to reconstruct the face, where we might use the forehead to make a nose. Free flaps work I do where we can take the forearm and bring it up to make a new face. But in the 21st century, we're looking at robotics to make new robotic arms, transplantation, face transplants. One of the people on our team in Cleveland is Maria Schimenow, that did the first face transplant, a program that I was able to help fund here in Boston at Brigham and Women's is Bo Pomadoc, who did a face transplant here in Boston last year. And regeneration, and I was talking to people here that do stem cell. We have a big program, again, almost $100 million to look at stem cell regeneration, to regenerate noses and ears. I supervise a lab, Jay Vacante's lab at MGH and Langer's lab. So there's a lot of people here that know the people that I somehow showed up, and I sit with these famous people and I say, I'm looking at your report for the last 3 months, what's missing here? Or I get to sort of look at that. So it's an incredible opportunity to try to tell everybody we're all on the same page. Our only goal at the end of the day is Jim Wright's goal, which is what can we do for the wounded warrior? And he was really very passionate about that. So what about war? Why is it sort of different, and why does it make medicine change things? So there's something in war called revolution in military affairs. And one of the reasons I can do what I do in Washington is I've, over the years, been a real military historian. So I've been involved in lots of panels, including one panel I sat on for Defense Science Board for a year on the future of war. And I was the only person that was an MD in my panel of 12. And at the summer study of 90 people, the only doctor at the entire study looking at military threats to America at the classified level was me. So I was considered a hobbyist in Irvine at this meeting. So everybody asked me medical questions. And finally, at the end of the meeting, they found out that Secretary Gates had just bought $20 billion worth of MRAPs, which are mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. Those are the huge vehicles you drive down the street to protect you against a bomb. And suddenly the enemy released a very inexpensive weapon called a explosive form projectile. It looks like one of those little plates back there you had the shrimp on. You mount it on the edge of an artillery shell. You fire it. It fires through this room at 8,000 meters per second, and everything between it and the two walls is gone, including whatever was in the vehicle. So I was asked at the end of that summer session in 2007, could I come up with a brief, meaning a speech, that would explain how to solve it? So I was given 2 days to put this together. First thing I did is called somebody in this audience, Kirby Vosberg, who's at CIMMT, and I said, Kirby, who are the best people you know in simulation? Help me out. So Kirby gave me some names, including an MIT person, Ralph Radovinsky. I put together a talk, presented it, and ended up running this medical panel where I brought together all the people I knew, a lot of them from that conference that Jim Wright had funded in 2006. So what this is all about is networking. So one of the things I have the ability to do is to network a lot of people together. When I was at Stanford before I came to Dartmouth, I got the Tom Sawyer Award for getting everyone else to paint the fence. And in fact, one of my best or worst evaluations from a student last fall, because a lot of students love what Peter and I do, but one student says, it's amazing how you can run a course and do so little, Dr. Rosen. Which was better than the evaluation my wife found and one of her friends got in the art department, which was, it's amazing that I learned nothing in your course. So I hope to never get that one, although I guess I don't know whether to look positively or negative in the fact that I can run a course and do no work. But there's a lot of work behind the scenes of just getting to know people. So what happens every once in a while is that military affairs, revolutionary military affairs, like trench warfare, like the Blitzkrieg in World War II, and like the present war, how the enemy is using certain types of blasts against us. And whenever that happens, there's a revolution in military affairs. So during the Civil War, when people used rifle bullets against the soldiers, and suddenly when you charged across the field, you were hit, a guy named John Letterman invented the flying ambulance, and he invented the modern healthcare system in America. Your hospitals, your triage centers, your ambulances, all of that was a product of the Civil War. Prior to that, we hadn't seen that. In fact, prior to the Civil War, there were 3,000 major operations a year in America. Once we trained that many thousands of surgeons, what we got was a big healthcare system that we can't get rid of ever since. So now suddenly we're inventing new things where if you're blown up, we can fly a helicopter in that's autonomous and pick you up, or we can treat you in the battlefield and do remote surgery. And there are whole talks on this that I'm not going to give today in terms of how we provide health care. But everything is suddenly changing. So to quote a plastic surgeon from the Vietnam War, Richard Stark, each war creates new problems that must be met with new challenges and new techniques. And what are the new problems from the global war on terrorism? So one of the things I'm an expert at in Washington that I work for a number of the agencies is I look at what's different about the global war on terrorism. Why is this war not a national insurgency? Why does the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have little to do with the actual war that began 9/11? That's a talk that I mentioned somebody I could give to the alumni. I have a declassified version of that, which is kind of interesting. So did anyone ever describe what war we're in? But that war we're in is causing a huge number of injuries, blast injuries, and we need to now deal with those. And these are injuries that we don't see in civilian practice. So in civilian practice, and doctors here visiting from Harvard and other medical centers here, we see people that fall down and break hips. We see people in car accidents at 80 miles an hour that are destroyed. But a blast injury, the force from a blast injury is devastating beyond what we know. And we do not have that happening as yet here, except for rare examples like the Murray building in '95 and injuries like 9/11. But we see it every day. 80% of these injuries in the war come from this. So back in 2004, I was invited to Walter Reed. I wanted to look at nerve injuries, and there's something called heterotopic ossification where you get bone in the body as a reaction to things. But I was asked to look at much more severe injuries. So I was asked to look at the more severe injuries from the war, and I was telling you before, 90% of the soldiers survive now. We have improved care with far forward surgical teams. So if you left this building and were run over, you may have a better chance of surviving in downtown Baghdad than in Boston in terms of the kind of advanced systems we're putting out at almost a point of injury to treat people. Plus you're not wearing body armor, or most of you aren't, although one of my graduates last year in urology, Curtis Crane, came to this graduation party wearing body armor. He went to next door to be on the dock, and I said, my next door neighbor has a gun, and he opens his chest up and he has body armor on, and I says, why do you have that? And he said, because I'm going to Detroit next month to do my fellowship. So 80% are improvised explosive devices, and these shells that were left behind in the war. And what's interesting about this is that when you think about these injuries, if we have a simple amputation we see every day here, and we look at high energy things that you might see in something like a car crash, the blast injuries we see in the battlefield are truly devastating. And not only are they devastating to the body, but they're devastating in terms of brain injuries. And as we look at, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So I do a lot of work for DARPA. And DARPA are the ones that invented the ARPANET, or the Internet, in 1969. They're a group that, when the Russians put up Sputnik in '57, Eisenhower said, how come they beat us to the punch? I want an agency, not Army, Air Force, or Navy, but they have enough money that we can try crazy things. So they do interesting projects. One of the projects I'm working on for them right now is if somebody blew this building up, I need to do an instant replay of the entire building and know what happened so that when the fire department responds, the police department, they know what happened to the building so they can better respond to the building. So that's a present project, which is impossible to do, like an instant replay in football. But that's the kind of thing that we do. So here's a notion that every soldier coming back from the war has a CT scan done of their entire body, so we can look at the injuries and understand what happened, so we can provide better body protection. And if you look at an explosion like this from one of these bombs that goes up, this, you can see all these little particles, so we scan them with their body armor on, but when you remove the clothes and the body armor, you can notice that the chest is well protected by the body armor, but there are injuries to the leg, to the arm, and to the head. And in fact, in the head, the damage went right through the brain, so that was a non-survivable injury. So when we look at the most difficult thing, which is catastrophic polytrauma, this is the kind of polytrauma that we have defining the war, and it's a polytrauma that we have no solution for. So what I'm trying to do is create a generation of surgeons, like a number in this room that have come, that can take somebody who's had such a devastating injury and reconstruct it with either regenerative medicine, transplantation, or robotics. And what I'll do is I'll talk about one of my patients who is, again, one of these people like out of Hurt Locker. So here's a fellow that had his face blown off, and I went down to Walter Reed with a team of surgeons, and they invited me in to help reconstruct him. So here's somebody with literally his face was blown off, and they put his face together by collapsing this, and you can see that this is kind of sheared off. And what we did is we took his forearm with skin and bone and put it up into his face. These are us as microsurgeons here at me and Walter Reed, and we took this bone with soft tissue and built a foundation on his face. So that was the first step. And then we went back and we took rib cartilage and bone from his ribs to reconstruct a foundation for his nose, and then took his forehead and brought it down to make kind of a clumsy nose for him. And then he's been going through several years from going from this all the way over here to make a respectable nose. And there's still another year or two of reconstruction going on for him outside of the military system. And here's the donor site. But I'm showing this as an example that this is where we are right now. And when the young surgeons in the room retire, they're going to find out that they're going to use stuff from Jay Vacante's lab and Catherine Sunback, and when they want a nose for this soldier, they're going to take some cartilage from one place, some skin, and they're going to grow a nose or grow an ear like that famous ear on the back of a rat, so they can regenerate the part. Or when it's really severe, like Bo Pomenack did at Brigham and Women's, or Maria Shimano did at Cleveland, we're going to find a donor and reconstruct the face with a face transplant. And you're going to say, well, the soldier doesn't want to undergo immune therapy for the rest of his life, and we're going to work out ways to create immune tolerance using stem cells so that we can take stem cells from the donor patient, give it to the recipient, and block the immune system in a selective way so they don't require triple or double or single therapies. So all of that is part of sort of these large grants we've been getting. So the classic patient is the one I mentioned before, which is James Thayer, who again lost both his arms. He has a major nerve injury in his leg. He's lost his face. He has a brain injury. So how do you solve him? So I was given the challenge when I went to Walter Reed to solve him, and if I solved this challenge, they would let me become a consultant. And in fact, it wasn't plastics that invited me, it was orthopedics. And rather than reaching out to the plastic surgery field, they reached out to Takeya Kanade, we talked earlier, who is a Japanese scientist at Carnegie Mellon. And I said the problem to solve this is not to rebuild him with robotic arms and a robotic face or a face transplant, but to create a smart environment so that when he moves into that smart environment like this room, his robotic shell around him or the room interacts with him to allow him to walk into this room and sit down comfortably in a chair and participate and be independent. So right now, outside of Pittsburgh, a collaboration between Walter Reed and Takeya Kanade are building him essentially a smart home to do that, which is amazing. So it's not just looking at what we do to the patient, but what we wrap around the patient in terms of smart devices and nanotechnology and robotics into a smart environment. And it's taking advantage of all the different things that we explore at Dartmouth Engineering School, and we reach out with Dartmouth as a hub to lots of other places to look at what we can do, whether it's in industry or institutes or other places. So when we look at the algorithm, when someone has a severe injury to their limb or their face, we can try to salvage it with surgery and end up with function. And that's what I do every day as a plastic surgeon. But sometimes we have non-function, which we see as a failure. So then we undergo an amputation and do a robotic arm. Here's an MIT Utah hand, and that's a four-fingered hand that's so good that it can play the piano, and it can whip an egg at 100 frames a second, so it can do things that your hand can't do. And when we have people come up in our spring course with robotic arms, they talk about things they can do with the robotic arms you can't do with a normal arm. For instance, they wave to a kid from their car and then they spin their hand around, and the kid says to the mom, "Look at that hand." Or they go to the shopping center at the co-op, they take their hand off and run it down the conveyor and then put it back on. Then we're going to talk about transplantation of faces. Tissue engineering, this is the early picture for Vacante and Langer of growing an arm. People have grown parts of bladder already, Tony Atala in Wake Forest. And earlier, Peter Robbie talked about this salamander growing an arm. And this is about getting into our genome and fixing it. So part of the project is scarless healing. So whenever you go to see your plastic surgeon, he says, I could take off the tumor, but you're going to have a scar. Now I say, I could maybe do scarless healing in the future. The problem is that I would have to manipulate your genome, and you may end up with scarless healing, like a salamander regenerates a limb. But on the way to work, you may get out of your car and lay 1,000 eggs in a pond or hide under a wet log. So I don't know what might come with it. So in closing, there's robotics. I work with Jeff Ling on a project, and here are some new robotic hands. They're 5-fingered hands. If you look at this robotic hand here, this is the end effector on the robots that are out, called the Da Vinci robot, that we have in operating rooms all over the country. Now this hand was designed by Akhil Madani, who's an MIT graduate student that I helped supervise when I did a sabbatical at MIT. And this hand now is a hand on hundreds of robots around the country. And here's a robotic hand that our soldiers will be getting to replace their hand. And some of the soldiers are going back into battle with robotic legs and robotic arms. So they want to go back and support their brothers. We look at transplantation. We could transplant a hand or transplant a face. I recently was at a meeting in January where there was a soldier, John Mahoney, a Marine, that lost his arm and got an arm transplant. We could shake hands. It was done about 8 months ago, and it works very well. So there's another solution that we're seeing happening right now. And finally, the big wisdom in the future from Jay Vacante's lab is, when do we grow this ear using stem cells like this bladder was grown with Tony Atala, who also is out of the Jay Vacante Langer group. So this is a big grant that we're involved in, and that's part of the future for us, how we're going to do that. So what we're seeing is that, like in Valley Forge in 1943, a huge problem that we don't know how to answer. What Joe Murray, who's a Nobel laureate from Harvard, was faced with was a guy named Charles Wood, who managed to be flying the Burma hump, crash, get an 80% burn, survive, an 80% burn, being transported 10,000 miles back to Valley Forge, and then spent years with Joe operating on him. We have the same thing now, where we're seeing people that we don't know what to do with. We're being amazed they've stayed alive, and rather than giving up on them, we're looking at new technologies, and Dartmouth is participating in that, and Jim Wright, the last president, really contributed to helping us create a community interested in doing this. Plus what he's done, which is great for me and others, is he's invited a large number of undergraduate veterans that fought in the war. So I have a whole group of veterans, and they came to me one day in my house on a Saturday morning, about a dozen of them sitting and looking at the river, and I said, look, you have your opinions about the war, right or wrong, and you'd like to get those opinions to the generals, and if you get me your opinions, I'll get you the feedback from the generals. And there was a battle that went really poorly last year, Wana, in Afghanistan. So they wrote a 57-page report, and I got it up to a 4-star general, Denny Reimer. And Denny Reimer wrote me a 3-page back letter saying that this is the worst thing he's ever read. So then I gave it back to my students, but then I went back after the general and said, I think you're wrong, and I think this is their view from their perspective as sergeants of what happened, and you have your view as the 4-star, but I think both views are valid. And he came back and didn't apologize, but he said that I agree with you, Joe, that there's more views to this war than just mine. So it's been a great experience for me at Dartmouth. One of the first things I did in '91 when I came up is I ran over to the engineering school to participate. And I found out the dean wasn't there. So I found Hutch's number, Charles Hutchison. I said, Hutch, we need to get together. Hutch said, where are you going to be? I said, well, tomorrow, unfortunately, I'm going to be in Boston. Hutch said, well, I'm returning to Hanover, but I'll drive down to Boston and meet you for breakfast. Where should we meet? And I said, now there's an amazing dean who would basically drive down several hours to meet with me, and he and I have worked ever since. In fact, we're working on projects right now, 20 years later, just like Peter Robbie and I have been working together for 40 years. So it's a great environment, Dartmouth. It's an environment where we work closely with the undergraduates. We try to get them very involved. We're looking at the new president, Jim Kim. I do global work. Next month I'll be in Vietnam. There'll be 3 medical students along with me. There's a number of undergraduates I send over there. The Dickey Center, the International Center, supported me to do that. And we look at how we can put this technology over there. There are MIT people here tonight that are looking at how to do low technology or high tech in low tech environments. So a lot of this sort of fits, whether we're doing global health, whether we're treating the individual. And the courses are great for us because we can use this huge number of undergraduates to open up our own eyes and tell me I'm wrong. So my favorite thing is when a student tells me I'm wrong and I can learn from their input. And the combination of me looking at this technology and Peter helping me and working on the design, so we work kind of hand in hand in these courses as a partnership we've had, which has been very rewarding for me. So it's just fun. We had a fun day today because of you to have kind of a road trip and come down and talk on the way down and go back. So thanks again for inviting us.